always changing.
So have they studied the coyotes since the wolves have been reintroduced then?
Pardon me?
Have they studied the coyotes since the wolves have been?
Yes, in Yellowstone in particular, because there was a lot of pre-work done in Yellowstone on coyotes. And the coyotes were in the same territories they were in when Adolph Murray studied them in the 1940s. Those territories were still occupied 50 years later by family groups of coyotes. Not the same coyotes, obviously, but it made sense. Since wolves were introduced, those have been largely fewer, and in between where those coyotes are able to defend a territory against wolves. I mean, wolves kill each other. Why wouldn't they kill a coyote? It's like competition.
Well, why don't you think they go after fox?
Coyotes do.
Yeah, but why would wolves go after fox?
I think the theory is they don't see them as a competitor. They're eating birds and stuff. I'm not interested in birds. Fox are much more cat-like in their behavior and their habits. You can see them walking down a fence line. They always remind me of a cat. You know, they'll get up on that top rail of the fence and walk along it. That always reminds me of a cat. Gray fox are even more cat-like in that they climb trees. If you're from the eastern half of the United States.
I have a question. How do folks in the conservation world, how are you thinking about invasive species, be it plant or animal? Because when I start thinking about that, we're all invasive species, right? I mean, we all just show up at one different time or another. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you define what you're conserving?
Yeah.
If with all this change that you're monitoring and all the dynamics of what's...
We know if you like what you got, you don't want to introduce exotics.
Yeah.
But I just had my mindset about exotics stood on its ear 2 years ago when I went to the Galapagos Islands. Every species on those islands is an invasive species. It has come from the mainland, and then it's changed since it got there. And they have done some math on that of how many invasive species hit their shores every year. And in the evolutionary sense, which that's a real laboratory for evolution, they don't necessarily see it as, they see it as a continuing process, not a frozen point in time where this is what we have, this is what we keep. And we don't want to lose this. Invasive species make us lose that. They have huge advantages that overwhelm the existing system. And the more, we're just going through this with the conservation biology with corridors. I mean, if it's a corridor for genetic movement or species movement or anything else, it can also move it invasively. And that can ruin a patch of habitat you're really trying to keep alive. So it's complex. But in general, we know that it's not a good thing. It hasn't happened in evolutionary time a lot, and systems get set up over ages, and an exotic can rapidly change it to the point of, the problem is it violates the principles of ecology. Just like in the stock market, you want a diverse portfolio of stocks because you don't know what's going to happen next. In the ecology, you want a diversity of species. If each one does something different and under the right conditions, they'll thrive and the system keeps going. Others will be at a disadvantage, like a drought or something. When you bring in invasives, you start to lose that biodiversity. And that's when it's bad.
So, in light of your comment about the Galapagos, I read in the newspaper recently that there were mountain goats that they've been finding in Grand Teton Park, and they're a little worried that they're going to bring diseases to the...
Not just diseases, but in Olympia National Park or whatever, it changed the plant ecology quite a bit because of the way they forage and what they eat. And it's oftentimes a boon to the species coming in that there's a whole smorgasbord of food out here, that there's been no competition. It's like wolves. We got naive elk. Great, it's a smorgasbord. But over time, that starts to change that ecology as well. And so, given the mission of the national parks to maintain this American heritage in our short little history, those kinds of things can be a detriment. And in Olympia National Park, they now have hunting seasons on goats inside the national park, just like we have an elk hunting season. It's one of the anomalies in the national park system, because they're trying to keep that number of mountain goats, which were put there by us. They weren't there over the last, 1,000 years.
Well, mountain goats are native to Yellowstone, aren't they?
Native to
Yellowstone?
Not so much. Yeah, the northern corner of Yellowstone. But their population is expanding as well. I mean, it's a post-glacial species. They're probably waning across the whole continent. In particular, the situation in Grand Teton is that they have that island population of sheep. It's a remnant. Used to be connected through East Gros Butte, probably, and over to Miller Butte, and up into the Gros and back and forth, etc. No longer that. So anytime one of the other principles of ecology is island biogeography. You don't want to create these islands like East Gros Butte that's cut off. If you do that, you start to see extinctions on it, and you lose your biodiversity. And we study this on islands like the Galapagos. But if we bring in goats in there, you're going to lose this remnant. The sheep are more likely to leak out. They're already questionable whether they will make it in the long run anyway. Just a genetic diversity of disease. You get one disease that wipe out the whole thing. There's no inflow of new animals in there to replace those that were gone. No genetic diversity. So goats could have an effect on that, and you lose one of the major resources of Grand Teton National Park.
The bighorn.
Pardon me? The bighorn sheep. Yeah. That's the real threat, is that it's been identified as a rare commodity in their park that they have to work at maintaining. You know, we're limiting where skiers can go in wintertime for fear of disturbing them, predisposing them to other agents of destruction like accidents or disease through stress. Thanks.
You were talking about naive the elk.
Yeah.
I think I read a study some years back, just before they reintroduced wolves. Somebody just went out and sat there and watched how often they raised their head and looked around.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't all that often. And that was like some primal back genetic memory. The minute wolves came, they were going, oh my God, oh my God. They were moving.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, very quickly they learned to look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're amazingly adept.
Yeah.
They do the same thing with hunting. They learn to avoid hunters pretty good.
Well,
It might not seem that way to you, but remember that 75%, 3/4 of people go out elk hunting, go home empty-handed. It's not that easy.
Didn't they say, I mean, isn't it true that, especially when they're not hunting on the refuge, that thousands of elk will literally cross the highway at night when nobody's out there, get me to the refuge?
Oh yes, yeah. By the same token, you realize that during the feeding, while they're feeding, a lot of elk choose not to go there. And a lot of elk leave there at night and come back. There are forays out and back, out and back. And probably a reflection of the fact that the feed ground situation is not really all that pleasant for them. All the things you can see in a human refugee camp that are negatives, you can also see on the feed ground. Disease, hyper levels of competition, you know, just a lot of stress among themselves.
Is there a change in the elk migration? Because this year, within the last 10 days, we've seen at least 800 elk coming down through the Wilson area that we haven't seen in previous years.
Well, you know, elk migration is driven to some degree by conditions. This fall rains, for example, sweetened up a lot of the land. So there's forage on a broader scale. We might even see that reflected in hunting success numbers. Elk, in the dry years, boom, you know where they are. They're within a mile of that water, and that's the way it is. Because the forage elsewhere is just suboptimal. It's just not as good. So, yeah, you do see differences in distribution year to year. These movements and general patterns can be very traditional, down to a single path, and they always go there. But if animals can't adapt, they're at a huge disadvantage. So there is a lot of pressure to pioneer a bit, but it's risky.
We've never, in the 20 years we've been there, we haven't seen this number of elk at any
Hung
time
up there.
before.
They've been basically a lot moving through the Fish Creek Range to the south.
Farther west.
This piece of land here, where the conservation easements are. I mean, most people refer to this as the Harrison Ford herd anyway. They're on Ford property. They're in this section of the river. They're not going to the feed ground. These elk go there and then come back and go and come back. But these elk coming out of this area have traditionally gone over here. This year they seem to be coming down this way, or they've been here and they're squishing back up. And some of that is social spacing. That there are so many elk in here right now, the grass is only this tall. If you go down into these properties down here, it's munched, it's mowed, and the shrubs are gone. And
Well, they've done a good job.
they start to get hungry, they're going to squish out into these other areas. And frankly, the Hardman Meadows, for example, have been grazed or hayed, and that regrowth is less fiber, more juice, especially with these late fall rains. It's a good year for them. I think they'll do well next spring when they have babies.
Well, they're in good condition. They're really fat.
Yeah. Summer looked bad, but as it turned out, those plants revived themselves those fall rains. We're now discovering a huge link between, well, it was always part of my teaching 40 years ago, that nutrition, the biggest link to reproduction, it's all about reproduction. We don't worry about animals dying. It's all about the factory staying open that produces new animals because you can't get rid of death. It's just always there. So you got to have lots of babies. There's no bigger influence on how many babies you're going to have and how many are going to survive than nutrition. Nutrition of those females. We are now with GPS collars and infrared technology and plant phenology, the changes in plants, really reinforcing that link. And these migration corridors are all about keeping those pregnant females and the ones that give birth and are lactating on the highest quality forage for the longest period of time in the summer. That's what they're doing. And they will move, we chart the plant growth. The minute that plant stops growing or slows down, those deer now move on. They are very sensitive to the plant phenology, more than we realize. But in my profession, technology just brings us better resolution on the principles that we already know, the stuff your grandma taught you. Every cattle rancher knows that his pregnancy rates are going to be determined on how well his cows are eating. If they're at a really high nutritional plane, more of them will get pregnant. And more of them will have a larger calf. There's no other feature more related to calf survival than birth weight. Bigger calves are better. So nutrition. So in my profession of wildlife management, that's what we focus on. It's all about habitat, it's all about the females, it's all about reproduction. We don't really care about the hunting. The hunting is, that's where the money comes from, to do, understand how the system works. And prevent a tragedy on the commons. Let's look at art.
You can just leave your cups and stuff here. I'll take it in the back later.
Corral them so they're free.
Sure. I mean, if you want to put them all like on this table, yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Let Jane know that that's headed into the gallery.
Okay. Thank you.
Can we leave our stuff in here?
Yeah.
Oftentimes in the wintertime, the calories they'll spend digging are more than the calories they'll get out of the boundary.
I've lived in the same spot 15 years, but last week I saw a great gray owl. Are they coming here? I've never seen one.
They're here, but they do shift their distributions based on rodent populations. So you might have a bit of a boom of mice or voles there.
Yeah,
that he's picking up on. And that's the advantage that they have. They're a flighted species, so they can move around in wintertime. Pronghorn antelope is what I know the most about, because that's what I did my master's on. Hi, Jane. I covet that sculpture right there more than anything that I've seen in the last 5 years. But there's the conservation story with pronghorn. 60 million bison, probably half that many pronghorn. They are ecological opposites of bison and cattle. What pronghorn eat, well, if you overgraze a pasture with cattle, the kinds of plants that come in are the kinds of plants that pronghorn like. If pronghorn are really hitting an area heavily, the kinds of plants that grow back in are the kinds that bison or cattle like. So they are considered ecological opposites in our grazing system here on this continent. And that theory of how that grazing system works, the littlest animals against the biggest animals, was developed in Africa with their array of large hoofed animals. But you see the large animals taking the coarse forage, and the small animals following behind them taking the regrowth and the fine forage. But what I've had many, many clients when I was bringing people here to Jackson that had never even heard of a pronghorn antelope before. Has anybody say that? I've never heard of this animal before. And it's so specialized and so unique that most people should know about it. I mean, it's the second fastest animal on the planet. It's the only animal with horns that fork. It's the only animal with horns that fall off every year, like antlers. They have changed their lungs and their stomach and their circulatory system, all for speed and weight. They don't put on body fat like a deer does. They have to have food throughout the winter, which is sagebrush. They've adapted to be able to eat sagebrush when most ruminant animals can't eat sagebrush very much because of the chemicals in it. So it's a really highly specialized animal. But they were virtually extinct. This animal's defense is to stand out in the open with other pronghorn and blend into each other, like a zebra herd blends into themselves. It's a predator avoidance mechanism, all these stripes on their necks and patches and that sort of thing. If you see a picture of a group of antelope bunched together, I dare you to try to count them. It's not easy. You can count 4 legs and divide by 4 or whatever, but there are great photographs out there how they blend into each other. But if you're a European person with a rifle, you love animals that stand out in the open during the daylight hours and show themselves. Bighorn sheep suffered from the same thing, just precipitous market hunting. Now, market hunting is far different than the way we hunt today. That was shooting them to sell. That's pretty much illegal in North America now. There are some exceptions, that you can shoot an animal and sell it. But for the most part, once we cut out market hunting, hunting has a totally different role. What drove these animals into extinction is market hunting. Same problem in Africa. Ivory's worth money. That drives those animals into extinction. So you take the money out of the equation, pretty much, and things change quite a bit. So
you use the expression pronghorn antelope. You
right.
Put them together. Is it?
Yeah.
Because I thought antelope was wrong.
Pronghorn antelope, if you write in scientific literature,
okay.
you can't just say antelope.
Okay.
You can say pronghorn, or you can say pronghorn antelope.
Okay, so you
I
can't.
blend the two together so everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yeah, okay, all right.
It's not a true antelope. You look at the photographs out there in the hallway of the antelope of Africa, they have little dew claws on the back of their legs, for among other things. But these animals have no dew claw on the back of their leg.
Yeah.
All in adaptation, they're halfway between a deer and a horse, as far as leg structure goes. All in adaptation for speed. You don't need those toes if you want to reach out really far and grab with 2 toes and pull. And that's what they're doing. These 2 toes serve no purpose. That's another reason why they don't like to jump. They don't have the cushion to land on those, and they break their legs if you force them to do that. But my point was going to be is, these were market hunted into extinction. Virtual extinction. In Wyoming, the first game laws were about pronghorn, and you could only shoot 2. Unless you were within 10 miles of your home, then you could shoot as many as you want. That's as far as we could get with game laws at the turn of the century. Because everybody relied on wildlife to eat. There were no grocery stores or going to town and buy some frozen meals. So, in addition to being a very unique, very highly specialized animal, they had that same role of conservation. They're a great success story in North America. Now, we've given antelope to every state in the Union, including Hawaii. Wyoming has 2/3 of the world's pronghorn antelope population. And in the eastern half of the state where I manage wildlife, I'm pretty much viewed as a trash species. You know? It's just antelope. You know? They're everywhere, like carp. Okay, we need to move on. Bison are your strongest story, of course, because everybody knows this. Everybody knows we shot them into extinction. Now we have bison hunting. We still carry, seems like, culturally now, still carry a lot of guilt of what we did to bison. It's like every bison is precious. From a conservation standpoint, they're having lots of babies. If the factory's open that produces new ones, if you take some out, it's not that big of a deal from a systems standpoint. We're more talking about values and aesthetics. But they're a great symbol for conservation. Again, there's bison in every state, but most of them are captive. There's only a few states that have wild and free-ranging herds. And states that have them are working at maintaining that wild and free-ranging status. That's what's unique about coming to Jackson. You see all of the animals that were here 100, 200 years ago, and they're still all wild and free ranging. There aren't captive animals, they're not in pastures or fences. That's the remarkable part, wild and free ranging. That takes a lot of space. That means you had to set aside a lot for an animal that moves like this one. We still don't know the migration patterns, historical, before the 1800s, of how bison use this continent. But they play a grazing role. Our cattle have replaced that grazing role as a large animal that eats rank old grass. We bred out of them some of the things we like in bison. We want our cows to hold still and have big babies and don't move around a whole bunch and don't jump fences. Bison do all those things, and we bred that right out of them because that doesn't work for our system of agriculture. Okay? Wolves, of course, is your hot topic, as you've told me. And that doesn't surprise me. Everybody's kind of aware of it. Great advertising for Jackson. The fact that the whole United States has read something about wolves. When I left Minnesota, we had wolves there in 1973, but I came to Montana, and the odds of seeing a wolf were 0. Absolutely 0. Not that they might not have been 1 or 2 there, but I couldn't see them. I couldn't hardly see them in Minnesota either because of vegetation. I could hear them, but they're just not that visible. Now, you give me one evening and one morning, I guarantee I'll show you a wolf. That's not a problem.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's a guaranteed thing. But it's a phenomenal, guaranteed, talking 90% success, 95% success. But it is so laden with human values of what they symbolize to any given person is different. And it was considered, before they were introduced, it was considered the litmus test. Are we serious about conservation? Because if we are, you have to deal with animals like wolves and all the negatives that come with them. You talk to people in Louisiana about how they feel about alligators. But at one time we were like, whoa, we got to conserve these alligators. Now it's like, who wants them? Minnesota, back in the 70s, offered Montana wolves. And Montana's answer was, fine, we'll swap you 1 for 1 with each grizzly bear. You put grizzly bears in Minnesota, we'll put wolves in Wyoming. So that gets you some feel for how the professionals even viewed it. They would make their lives miserable. My personal viewpoint is, wolves are a great economic engine. And even the talks that started in 1940 with Aldo Leopold, followed up with Luna Leopold in the Yellowstone report that they ought to be put back into this large system, has generated more human activity and economic activity than you can shake a stick at. People hiring lawyers, people raising money, people looking at them, people dreaming about them, whatever. It's great for the economy. If you look at it that way, it even generates art.
When was that painting done? Does it say?
This painting? Yeah, it does say in the 30s, 1930. But in Denmark, I believe. He's from Denmark. I don't know what his exposure to wolves were. But what always fascinates me is nighttime paintings. Artists don't go out at night, and I see it as an amazing challenge when they do it. I don't know how to paint something in the dark. The most amazing ones I've seen is Francis Lee Jacques' Francis Lee scratch boards, which are a reverse image at night, which you would reverse the image again for, and there's a lot of thought goes into that. Fascinating. Does anybody want to bring this up about how wolves fit into the conservation scenario?
I could be wrong. I may be saying, what was it, the Trophic Cascade?
The Trophic Cascades. What fascinates me is, for 20 years we talked about what will happen when we put wolves back into the Yellowstone ecosystem. And gathered all the experts in the world, all the wolf experts, all the elk experts, and everybody put in their 2 cents worth, and everybody who lives there put in their 2 cents worth. One thing we didn't guess was there was going to be this trophic cascade or cascading effects of a keystone carnivore changing a keystone herbivore, which changes plant communities, which changes who can use those plant communities, etc. And there are probably several cascades going on, only a few of which we've identified. But that was the most amazing part of the experiment. I've always viewed it as an experiment. Put the animal in and see what's happened. We got rid of them in the 20s with no 4-wheel drives or helicopters. We could certainly get rid of them again if we wanted to. So let's go ahead. What's the harm? it's okay to be wrong in ecology, you just can't be wrong too long. So there's a time and space component with ecology, because it fluctuates all the time. So I'm very open to the variety of attitudes we might have towards large carnivores like this. I see it from a different, more scientific experiment kind of.
Every tourist that I've ever mentioned it to is more interested in that than anything else in this museum.
Mm-hmm. Really powerful symbols, both positive and negative.
Is that what happens when wolves come back?
Well, it's among the things that happen.
Yeah.
We'll see some cascades that we don't like too,
Right.
probably.
Yeah.
And they'll get identified through time.
Like killing sheep and killing dogs and
Like what?
killing sheep and killing dogs.
No, I mean like if elk populations are going to go down to a certain carrying capacity with wolves being present, and distributions are going to shift, that's going to affect other species as well. Some of which we might cherish. I mean, it might be marmots for all I know. Suddenly there's no marmots. Well, it's because there's no elk left, you know. Those kinds of cascades can happen as well. So keep in mind that in regard to wolves, we've seen this big increase in wolves. What nature likes to maintain diversity is also crashes in wolves. And then there's a response from that. And then a resurgence of, well, this is how it all goes. And that's okay. We just don't live long enough. Like the fires in Yellowstone. It's going to be a beautiful forest if it isn't already. We just might not live long enough. But it's doing what it's always done. And it's an amazing opportunity to let things do what they've always done, or to learn from things like putting wolves in, an act of man. We're learning a tremendous amount. And it's confirming a lot of basic principles, yeah.
The experiment that was done up on Isle Royal back in the 60s is an excellent example of how nature balances out the prey or the predator in terms of numbers.
And most people aren't aware that those studies have continued on. And the first hypothesis of how that went with wolves and moose and plants in between has not carried out exactly like that.
It hasn't?
No.
Oh, really?
No. Yeah.
This is an old friend back, huh?
Yeah. I haven't done any
You've
docent
been
training
training for
15 years.
Yeah, that's great.
But this is my aspiration to become a docent.
Yellowstone, anyway, is a beautiful nursery. If anybody drives in there and sees all those beautiful new trees, it's magnificent.
Yeah.
You know? And you,
for better or worse, some people really like old trees, not young trees. You know, my wife, when she drove through in 1965 or whatever, she couldn't see anything off the road. There's all these trees, you know.
And this gentleman has a graduate degree on the pronghorn. So if anybody wants any in-depth information.
They already wasted about 20 minutes of their time with pronghorn. What comes to mind with elephants is Tsavo Wildlife Park in South Africa. When I was in college in the 70s, it was used as an example of the inability, the inexact science of it. They counted all the elephants in the national park, and then they counted them 10 years later and found they'd underestimated the elephants by 80%. And indeed, there were so many elephants that it was changing the vegetation. The point being from my professors is, if you can't count antelope, you definitely can't count pronghorn. You know, I mean, how hard is it to count elephants? They're huge. You know? But all of these species are difficult to monitor and understand everything that's going on, and it's not an exact science. And we're learning more all the time. But that's my story about conservation in elephants.
What is the estimate as to how many pronghorn there are in Jackson area?
In Wyoming?
Yeah.
Well, let's take Wyoming. There are just slightly more antelope in Wyoming than there are people, about 500,000. But remember, you know, they have babies in the spring, and suddenly there's 800,000, and then by fall again there's, you know, less. But it averages out to about 500,000. 500,000 after the hunting seasons. Yeah. So elephants, conservation-wise, is the example of current market hunting. That your information talks about the ivory market, and it's driving their populations. We are in what people are referring to is the Anthropocene, you know, the Miocene, the Pleistocene, all that sort of thing. We're now in the Anthropocene. There are so many of us that every system is affected by the presence of humans. Every single system. right down to geology. I don't know if you saw in the newspaper, but the seismologists picked up the crowd roar at the stadium about 3 weeks ago. It shook the earth. That's how much we're in the Anthropocene. If we get enough of us together, we can do anything. Except swing an election. Tigers throughout the world are struggling. This is about habitat fragmentation. A large carnivore needs high levels of prey in a big area. Like grizzly bears, they only tolerate each other when there's a hyperabundance of food. Then you'll see grizzly bears all together at a fishing stream or rolling over rocks for moths. Most of the time, they don't really like each other. It's certainly the case with cats. So it requires a huge amount of space of jungle and systems flowing. Anything else about tigers that I might?
It's not related to tiger, but I was talking about a friend a few days ago. The only really social cat is the lion, isn't it? Mm. And they are social,
stop and think about
unlike the other cats.
You know, family groups are different. Cheetahs, you can see cheetahs in family groups, that sort of thing. But outside of family groups, you might be right. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah. We had visitors from Russia last year, met with the Land Trust about conservation. They've created some huge national parks around the leopards there. And their biggest problem is, well, they have several problems. They don't have the same governmental system that we set up. Nobody owns anything. It's all commons. And privileges are allocated out by a government that doesn't exist anymore. Very different. We can't really think about how things are going to work over there the way we think about they over. You know, he talked about going, they have a huge national park 3 times larger than Yellowstone, and they got a staff of 3. So he's not talking to this logger who has a permit to log in what now is a national park, and the government that gave him that doesn't exist anymore. It's been totally changed over. And he's talking to him about you shouldn't be cutting these trees. And the military zooms right over their head and bombs an area just inside the national park, just beyond where they're talking. He says, that's what I'm up against in trying to create a national park. The biggest point that amazed them was that the Army came in to Yellowstone and set up the boundaries. That blew them away. The fact that it would be part of the American model, that you would have to have, what do they call that, martial law, and the military secure the borders of the national park, and that became their charge. That's totally out of his mindset. That just was really exciting to him. I said, well, you need to look more into that history because the Army occupied the Yellowstone it wouldn't have been there if the Army hadn't been there. And, physically threatened to shoot people if they came in there, Okay. So they're right next to China, and they have lots of people coming over the border. He claimed in groups of 100 or more men and taking whatever they wanted. So small civilian armies taking and coming and getting what they wanted because they had so little, or they were like the Somalian pirates. Polar bears, this is a different threat. It's not that their space isn't there, it's just they're adapted for temperatures and things like that. So it's all about a warming climate, warming globe, and they symbolize, they're really great symbols as well, like wolves. Endearing and cuddling and special, or threatening to your existence. This picture depicts that's pretty close. And we all know that they're like other bears, they're busy doing what they always do. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you become part of their business, but for the most part, you're not. There's been several studies done, one in Alaska that I'm aware of, and one recently here, about how much a person in the woods displaces bears over big, huge landscapes. The study that was the most telling was GPS-collared bears. They're getting, real-time locations of these bears. And the professor sent 2 of his graduate students out to sit on the banks of the spawning streams and count bears. So they just sat there all day and counted bears. It was like a pinball machine. They bumped one bear, that bear bumps the other bear, that bumps the other bear, and there was this whole donut. If you've been to Africa, maybe you've seen that. Wherever the predator is where the animals aren't. You know what I mean? You find these donut holes and there's probably a kill in the middle of it. That's what happens. we get a huge amount of respect as a creature from all the other wildlife. And it's why we're like puny, nothing we can do. But whether they're hunted or not, animals, I just saw it on the way in here, looking at the sleigh rides out there, and there's a group of bulls there, and they have the sleighs parked there, and all the bulls turned away. Just our staring has an impact on them. Pointing, looking with binoculars, that all makes them feel a bit self-conscious. In their world, a lot is settled with eye contact. So say the sleigh rides, they're used to it, that sort of thing. Yes, but I can see behavioral changes the minute they go out there. Is it enough to be biologically significant? Probably not.
One person gets out of that sleigh and that whole herd is gone.
Yeah, and then if the humans change their behavior, why? I mean, how threatening is one guy or one woman? But that's the level of respect we get.
Do you think
Grizzly bears don't come into town and get one of us every night. They certainly could. There's nothing to stop
Do you
them.
think it's our attitude as a species?
Is it their what?
Our attitude as a species that we don't, or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah, we act very aggressively.
Yeah.
It's exactly what your mother told you. It's rude to point and stare. You know? And it's more so in their world than our world. But the way we walk, you watch an elk walk for the most part, and let's take a few steps and graze a little bit and take a few steps. We walk very deliberately, let alone our shape, our form upright. But I use, this is a longer story, but I use a cow costume to hunt geese with. And it's great, it works great. But the hard part is you have to behave like a cow. And cows don't move very fast. So you bring the deck of cards, you play cards in there, and smoke cigars, whatever, just to pass the time. And okay, another 10 minutes to go by. Okay, let's move a little bit. Over time, they accept you as a cow. It's not hard to look like a cow, it's hard to behave like a cow. I know.
Take those notes.
I'm hesitant to bring it up because I'm convinced that at my funeral somebody's going to bring up this story, Like, no, that's not what my life was about. About the cow costume. That's how egocentric I am. Already thinking about how my funeral ought to go.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up for today. Hopefully, what we had in mind, and I think Tom did an incredible job with, is this is a set of tools that you all can use. We want you to be aware of it. If, even if you're not a docent, these are great stories to know and really good information to know about our area. And then if you're a gallery guide or a docent, this is stuff that's going to be very, very relevant to the visitors as they come through. And think about, theming a tour on conservation, or maybe theming a tour on a specific animal that's represented in the conservation gallery, and take some time finding where else they exist in the different galleries. But just something to think about and take with you, and there are a lot of resources out there, including people like Tom and the Land Trust. So thanks to Tom for coming.